The gunshot that shattered the morning stillness of Copper Creek also shattered Ruby Foster's world, sending her father tumbling from his horse with a crimson stain spreading across his chest. It was May 1876, and in that moment, 18-year-old Ruby lost not only her father, but her place in the world as she knew it. "Papa!" Ruby screamed, sliding from her mare and dropping to her knees beside his crumpled form. Sheriff Nathan Foster's eyes found hers, glassy with pain, his breath coming in short gasps as he clutched at his daughter's hand. "Run," he whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Ruby, my girl, you run." But Ruby couldn't move, frozen in horror as her father's grip went slack. The riders who had ambushed them emerged from the cover of pine trees, their faces obscured by bandanas. For men on horseback, circling like vultures. Well, drawled the leader, tipping back his hat. "Sheriff's pretty daughter, all alone. Ain't that a stroke of luck, boys?" Ruby's blood turned to ice. She knew what happened to women who fell into the hands of outlaws. With trembling fingers, she reached for her father's revolver, but the leader was faster, dismounting and kicking the weapon away. "Feisty little thing," he laughed, grabbing her arm and yanking her to her feet. What happened in the next hours would haunt Ruby's nightmares for years to come. When they finally left her battered, violated, and half dead beside her father's body, she wished they had killed her too. But Ruby Foster didn't die. Somehow, she made it back to Copper Creek, dragging herself to Doc Morrison's door in the dead of night. The kindly doctor and his wife took her in, treated her wounds, and listened to her broken whispers about the men who had killed her father and stolen something precious from her that could never be returned. Word spread quickly through the small town. Sheriff Foster murdered. His daughter attacked. Outlaw gang headed north. A posse formed to hunt them down, but it was too late. The gang had vanished into the vast frontier, leaving Ruby to face the whispers and sidelong glances of a town that had once respected her. "Poor girl," they'd say, voices hushed as she passed. "Such a tragedy." But behind their sympathy lurked judgment, as if her violation had somehow tarnished her, as if she were damaged goods. Ruby moved into her father's small house on the edge of town, unable to face selling the only home she'd ever known. The neighbors brought food for a time, but their visits grew less frequent as weeks passed. The church ladies still nodded politely on Sundays, but their invitations to socials and quilting circles dried up entirely. By summer's end, Ruby had withdrawn almost completely. She tended her garden, fed her chickens, and existed in solitude. Sheriff Foster had left her with the house and enough money to survive modestly, but the future stretched before her like an empty desert. At 18, most girls her age were courting or already married. No respectable man would court her now, not with her reputation in tatters. It was on a sweltering August afternoon that Blake Warren rode into Copper Creek, stirring the dust of Main Street with his sorrel stallion's hooves. At 25, he cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and keen eyes the color of a summer storm. His Stetson was pulled low, and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. Blake dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post. He'd been riding for the better part of 2 weeks, pushing west from Missouri with little more than his horse, his guns, and the clothes on his back. The small Wyoming town wasn't his destination. He didn't have one in particular, but his supplies were dwindling, and the sorrel needed rest. "Afternoon," greeted the shopkeeper, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose. "What can I help you with, stranger?" "Coffee, flour, beans," Blake replied, setting his hat on the counter. "Ammunition for a Colt .45. And information, if you're selling that too." The shopkeeper chuckled, already gathering the requested items. "Information's free. What sort are you looking for?" "Work. The honest kind." Blake had spent 5 years as a ranch hand in Missouri before the drought forced his employer to sell off. He'd tried his hand at bounty hunting for a spell, but the work didn't sit right with his conscience. "Well now," the shopkeeper stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Wilcox Ranch might be hiring. They lost a couple hands last month in a stampede. Terrible business. Or there's Miller's place, but he works a man to the bone for half what he's worth." Blake nodded, committing the names to memory. "Town got a boarding house." "Sure does. Mrs. Hargrove's place, 2 blocks down. Clean beds, fair prices, and the best flapjacks this side of the Mississippi. The shopkeeper paused, studying Blake more carefully. You planning to stay a while, mister? Warren. Blake Warren. And I might, if there's work to be had. Well, Mr. Warren, welcome to Copper Creek. Blake paid for his supplies and headed to the boarding house, securing a room for the night. After a hot bath and a hearty meal, he ventured to the local saloon, not for the whiskey or the girls, but for the conversation. Saloons were the pulse of frontier towns, where gossip and opportunities flowed as freely as the liquor. He was nursing a beer when he first heard Ruby's name. Foster girl still keeping to herself, commented a grizzled rancher to his companion. Saw her at Foster's grave yesterday, laying flowers. Pitiful sight. She ought to sell up, move somewhere fresh, replied his friend. No future for her here, not after what happened. What happened? Blake found himself asking before he could think better of it. The men turned to him, sizing him up with narrowed eyes. Town business, the first man said shortly. Ain't for outsiders. But the bartender, wiping a glass nearby, was more forthcoming. Sheriff Foster was murdered 4 months back. Outlaws. They. He lowered his voice, though the meaning was clear enough. His daughter found no justice. Posse couldn't catch the gang. Now she's alone, and folks don't know what to do with her. Blake frowned. Why should they do anything with her? The bartender shrugged uncomfortably. Some things change how people see you, deserved or not. The conversation shifted, but Blake couldn't shake the story from his mind. There was something in it that struck a chord perhaps, because his own sister had faced similar judgment after surviving an attack in their hometown. The cruel whispers had driven her to take her own life, a wound that had never fully healed in Blake's heart. The next morning, he rode out to the Wilcox Ranch and secured work as a ranch hand. The pay was decent, the bunkhouse clean, and the foreman fair. Blake settled into the routine of ranch life easily, riding fence lines, breaking horses, and driving cattle. On his days off, he'd ride into town for supplies and a hot meal at the only restaurant in Copper Creek. It was on one such visit, nearly 3 weeks after his arrival, that he finally saw Ruby Foster. She was emerging from the general store, a basket of supplies on her arm. Even from a distance, Blake could see she was beautiful, slender, and graceful, with copper-red hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet. But it was the way she carried herself that caught his attention, chin held high despite the way women on the boardwalk subtly shifted away as she passed, like they feared her misfortune might be catching. Blake watched as Ruby walked briskly toward the edge of town, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her. Without quite knowing why, he found himself moving in her direction, his long strides easily catching up to her near the town's small church. "Excuse me, miss," he called. "You dropped something." Ruby turned, wariness etched in her features. Her eyes were a startling green, bright against her pale skin, but shadowed with a pain that made Blake's chest tighten. "I didn't drop anything," she said softly, clutching her basket tighter. Blake produced a handkerchief from his pocket. "My mistake. Must have been the lady ahead of you." Ruby glanced at the empty street behind her, then back at Blake with a hint of irritation. "There was no one ahead of me. Wasn't there?" Blake feigned surprise. "My eyes must be failing me." "Since I bothered you anyway, might I introduce myself?" "Blake Warren, madam. New hand at the Wilcox place." A flicker of something confusion, suspicion, perhaps both crossed Ruby's face. It had been months since anyone in town had spoken to her directly without necessity. "Ruby Foster," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Though I expect you already knew that." Blake smiled, not denying it. "I did hear the sheriff was your father. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Foster." Ruby's shoulders stiffened, waiting for the inevitable questions or pity that followed such statements. When none came, she relaxed slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Warren." She glanced toward the church, where Reverend Phillips had appeared in the doorway, watching their exchange with obvious disapproval. "I should be going." Blake followed her gaze, noting the Reverend's frown. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." Ruby nodded and continued on her way, feeling Blake's eyes on her back. It was a strange sensation to be looked at without judgment or morbid curiosity. Just a simple conversation, the kind she'd once taken for granted. That night, alone in her father's house, Ruby found herself thinking of the tall stranger. There had been something sincere in his storm-gray eyes, something that had made her feel, for the briefest moment, like a normal young woman again instead of a living cautionary tale. Blake, meanwhile, returned to the ranch with Ruby Foster occupying his thoughts. There was a story there, one of resilience and quiet dignity in the face of a town's collective rejection. It reminded him painfully of Emily, his sister who hadn't found the strength to endure such treatment. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed occasionally. Blake made a point of tipping his hat to Ruby when he saw her in town, sometimes exchanging a few words about the weather or offering to carry her packages. Each time, she responded with cautious politeness that gradually warmed with familiarity. It was after church one Sunday in late September that Blake made his intentions clearer. The congregation was filing out into the autumn sunshine, and Ruby, as was her custom, slipped away quickly to avoid the social gathering on the church lawn. Blake followed, catching up to her on the path that led toward her home. "Miss Foster," he called. "Mind if I walk with you?" Ruby paused, turning to face him with surprise. "People will talk, Mr. Warren." "People already talk," he replied simply, falling into step beside her. "Does it bother you?" Ruby considered this, her skirts rustling against the fallen leaves. Not as much as it used to. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the church spires receding behind them. The trees along the path were ablaze with autumn colors, and the air carried the crisp scent of apples from nearby orchards. "Why are you being kind to me?" Ruby asked suddenly, stopping to face Blake. "You must have heard the rumors by now." Blake met her gaze steadily. "I've heard talk. Most of it unkind and all of it unnecessary. I don't put much stock in gossip, Miss Foster." "It's not all gossip," she said quietly, her hands twisting in her skirt. "Some of it is true. She faltered, unable to say the words. "You survived," Blake finished gently. "That's the part that matters." Ruby's eyes widened, shimmering with unshed tears. No one had framed it that way before, as if living through her ordeal was an act of courage rather than a mark of shame. "My sister," Blake continued, his voice rough with emotion, "she didn't survive, that is. Something similar happened to her back in Missouri. The whispers followed her until she couldn't bear it anymore." He swallowed hard. "I see her courage in you, Miss Foster, and I admire it." A tear slipped down Ruby's cheek. "I'm sorry about your sister. I'm sorry about what happened to you," Blake replied. "But I'd like to know you, Ruby Foster. Not the story people tell about you, but you, if you'd permit it." Ruby wiped her cheek with trembling fingers. "You'll regret it. No man wants a wife who's been." She trailed off again, the words still too painful to speak. "I haven't mentioned marriage," Blake said with a small smile. "Though I won't pretend the thought hasn't crossed my mind. I'm suggesting friendship, to start. Sunday walks. Maybe dinner sometime, if Mrs. Hargrove's cooking doesn't improve at the boarding house." A reluctant laugh escaped Ruby's lips, sounding rusty with disuse. "You're a strange man, Blake Warren. Is that a yes to friendship?" Ruby hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Though I warn you, friends of mine aren't particularly popular in Copper Creek these days." Blake shrugged, unconcerned. "Fortunate, then, that I've never much cared for popularity." That Sunday walk marked a turning point. Though Ruby remained wary, she allowed Blake into her closely guarded world bit by bit. He began stopping by her house after work sometimes, helping with repairs her father would have handled: a leaking roof, a broken fence post, a stubborn pump. In return, she would offer coffee or, on occasion, a slice of fresh-baked pie. They talked during these visits. Blake told her about growing up in Missouri, about his sister Emily and her tragic end, about his years working cattle and his dreams of having his own ranch someday. Ruby shared memories of her father, of learning to shoot and ride almost before she could walk, of her mother who had died of fever when Ruby was just 10 years old. What she didn't speak of was the attack, and Blake never pressed. But sometimes, when a sudden noise made her jump or a distant rider caused her to pale, he understood what she was remembering. On those occasions, he would simply continue their conversation as if he hadn't noticed, giving her time to collect herself without drawing attention to her fear. October arrived with its golden afternoons and frosty mornings. Blake continued his work at the Wilcox Ranch, earning a reputation as a skilled horseman and reliable hand. The foreman, impressed with his work ethic, promoted him to head wrangler when the previous man quit to try his luck in the gold fields. Ruby, meanwhile, began venturing out more frequently. She started selling eggs and vegetables from her garden at the general store, ignoring the whispers that still followed her. With Blake's encouragement, she even attended the harvest festival, though they kept to the edges of the celebration rather than joining the dancing. Their friendship did not go unnoticed or uncriticized. Blake received warnings from well-meaning townspeople about associating with that poor ruined girl. Reverend Phillips even took it upon himself to visit Blake at the ranch, speaking gravely about the dangers of keeping company with a woman of compromised virtue. Blake listened politely, then told the Reverend in no uncertain terms that he considered Ruby Foster to be one of the most virtuous women of his acquaintance, and that perhaps the good Reverend might better spend his time preaching Christian charity to his congregation rather than perpetuating cruelty toward a blameless young woman. The Reverend left in a huff, and word of the exchange spread quickly through Copper Creek. Some applauded Blake's defense of Ruby. Others muttered that the newcomer would learn his lesson eventually. But no one could deny that Ruby seemed changed by his attention. There was color in her cheeks again, and occasionally people even heard her laugh. As November's chill settled over the valley, Blake's visits to Ruby's home became more frequent. They would sit by the fire, reading or talking, sometimes playing cards, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. It was during one such evening, with snow falling gently outside the window, that Blake finally spoke of what had been growing between them. "I care for you, Ruby," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "more than as a friend." Ruby's hands stilled in her lap, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "You shouldn't." "But I do," he persisted gently. "And I think you might care for me too." "It doesn't matter what I feel," Ruby whispered. "I can't be what a man needs in a wife. I'm damaged, Blake. Used." Blake moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Look at me, Ruby." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. "What happened to you was a crime. A terrible, unforgivable crime. But it did not make you less worthy of love or happiness. It did not diminish your value in my eyes or in God's." Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks. "The town will never accept it. They'll say you married damaged goods." "Let them talk," Blake said firmly. "Their opinions mean nothing to me. It's your opinion I care about, Ruby Foster. Do you think you could love me in time?" Ruby's breath caught. "I already do," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "But loving you and marrying you are different matters. I couldn't bear to see the light in your eyes dim when you realized what you tied yourself to." Blake cupped her face in his hands. "The only thing dimming the light in my eyes would be watching you believe their lies about yourself. You are brave and strong and beautiful, Ruby. The woman I want to build a life with." "You deserve better," she insisted. "There is no better," Blake countered. "There's only you, as you are. And that's exactly who I want." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed his lips gently to hers in a kiss so tender it made fresh tears spring to her eyes. When they parted, Ruby looked at him with wonder and fear mingled in her gaze. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Not of you, but of hoping again. Of believing happiness might be possible." "We'll take it slow," Blake promised. "One day at a time. But I'm not going anywhere, Ruby Foster. Not unless you send me away." Ruby didn't send him away. Instead, over the coming weeks, their relationship deepened. Blake proposed properly just before Christmas, offering a simple silver ring that had belonged to his mother. Ruby accepted with trembling hands and a heart full of conflicting emotions, joy battling with lingering shame, hope wrestling with fear. They agreed to marry in the spring, when the wildflowers would carpet the hills around Copper Creek. Blake continued working at the Wilcox Ranch, saving every penny toward buying a small spread of their own someday. Ruby prepared for a future she had once thought impossible, adding to her hope chest and learning to quiet the voices of doubt that still whispered in her mind. News of their engagement spread through town like wildfire. Some congratulated them sincerely. Others offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. A few, including the Reverend's wife and her circle of friends, made their disapproval known more openly. "She's trapping that poor man," Mrs. Phillips was overheard saying at the general store. "He doesn't know what he's getting himself into, marrying a girl with her history." Such comments invariably made their way back to Ruby, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. There were nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she was being selfish in accepting Blake's proposal. Nights when she almost convinced herself to break the engagement for his sake. But each time she saw Blake, his unwavering devotion chased away her doubts. He looked at her not with pity or resignation, but with genuine love and admiration. When they were together, the whispers faded to insignificance. January brought heavy snows that blanketed the valley in pristine white. Travel became difficult, and Blake's visits less frequent as his duties at the ranch increased. It was during one particularly fierce blizzard, when Blake had been unable to visit for nearly a week, that trouble arrived at Ruby's door. She was stoking the fire when a pounding on the door startled her. Grabbing her father's revolver from the mantel, she approached cautiously. "Who's there?" she called. "Open up, girl," came a slurred voice. "It's damn cold out here." Ruby recognized the voice of Tom Bradley, a local drunk known for his mean temper. "Go away, Mr. Bradley. It's late." "Ain't too late for a friendly visit," he laughed crudely. "Heard you're getting hitched to that Wilcox hand. Thought I'd see what he's paying for." Ruby's stomach churned with disgust and fear. "I have a gun, Mr. Bradley. My father taught me how to use it. Now go home before you freeze." There was silence, then the sound of shuffling feet and muttered curses. Ruby remained frozen by the door, listening as Bradley's footsteps crunched away through the snow. Only when she was certain he was gone did she sink to the floor, shaking with reaction. The incident rattled her more than she wanted to admit. It brought back the terror of the attack, the helplessness she'd felt at the hands of men who viewed her as nothing more than an object for their use. She didn't tell Blake about it when he finally made it through the snow 2 days later, not wanting to worry him. But her newfound confidence had taken a blow, and the old doubts crept back in. February brought a thaw, and with it, preparations for the spring wedding began in earnest. Blake had secured a small cabin closer to town where they would live until they could afford land of their own. Ruby sewed curtains and quilts, finding comfort in the rhythmic work of her needle. It was Mrs. Wilcox, the ranch owner's wife, who first showed real kindness to Ruby beyond Blake's circle. She invited Ruby to tea at the ranch house, greeting her warmly despite the raised eyebrows of her housekeeper. "My husband speaks very highly of your fiancé," Mrs. Wilcox said, pouring fragrant tea into delicate cups. "Says he's the best hand with horses he's seen in 20 years. "Blake has a way with animals," Ruby agreed, carefully balancing her cup. The Wilcox home was grander than any she'd been in before, with its polished furniture and real glass windows. "And with people too, I think," Mrs. Wilcox observed with a kind smile. "I've noticed a change in you since he came to town, Miss Foster. It does my heart good to see it." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been a true friend when I needed one most." "More than a friend now," Mrs. Wilcox winked. "And I'd like to be your friend too, if you'll permit it. This town has treated you poorly, and I'm ashamed to say I've done nothing to stop it until now." Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes. "You're very kind, Mrs. Wilcox. Margaret, please. And it's not kindness, just belated decency. Now, tell me about your wedding plans. Have you spoken with Reverend Phillips?" Ruby tensed. "Not yet. I'm not sure he'll agree to perform the ceremony." Margaret Wilcox's eyes flashed with indignation. "If he refuses, my husband will have something to say about it. The Wilcox family built that church, and we still pay the Reverend's salary." The unexpected support from such a respected figure in the community gave Ruby a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps, with time, others would follow Margaret Wilcox's example. Perhaps she and Blake could build a life in Copper Creek after all. But the Reverend proved to be a more formidable obstacle than anticipated. When Blake approached him about setting a date for the wedding, Reverend Phillips cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'm afraid I cannot in good conscience perform this ceremony, Mr. Warren," he said, folding his hands on his desk. "Miss Foster's situation is, well, it presents certain moral complications." Blake's jaw tightened. "What moral complications would those be, Reverend?" "Ruby is a faithful Christian woman who has suffered greatly. Where in the Bible does it say she should be punished further?" "It's not a matter of punishment," the Reverend protested. "It's about the sanctity of marriage. Miss Foster's experience means she cannot enter into matrimony as a pure woman should." Blake leaned forward, his voice dangerously soft. "Are you suggesting that because Ruby was attacked, she is somehow less deserving of happiness? That she should live alone forever because of a crime committed against her? The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. I'm suggesting that there are consequences too. Irregularities. The church has standards. Christ welcomed Mary Magdalene. Blake interrupted. He defended the woman caught in adultery. What standards are you upholding that are higher than his example? This is different. Yes, it is, Blake agreed coldly. Those women chose their actions. Ruby was an innocent victim. Yet you would show her less mercy than Christ showed to sinners. The Reverend's face flushed. I cannot be moved on this matter, Mr. Warren. I will not perform the ceremony. Perhaps you should consider if this marriage is truly God's will. Blake stood, his expression hard. I know it is, Reverend, and we will be married, with or without your blessing. Good day. He left the Reverend's office seething with anger, not for himself, but for Ruby. How could a man of God be so heartless? So bound by rigid morality that he couldn't see the cruelty in his position? Blake didn't immediately tell Ruby about the Reverend's refusal. Instead, he rode to the Wilcox ranch and sought out Mr. Wilcox himself, explaining the situation. The ranch owner, a practical man with little patience for hypocrisy, agreed to speak with the Reverend. His wife, Margaret, went a step further, organizing a delegation of influential church members to apply pressure. The town quickly divided into factions. Many sided with the Reverend, arguing that rules existed for a reason and exceptions couldn't be made, even in sad cases like Ruby's. Others, influenced by the Wilcoxes' open support and Blake's unwavering devotion, began to question whether their judgment of Ruby had been fair. Ruby herself was torn between anger at the injustice and resignation to what she had always expected. When Blake finally told her about the Reverend's position, she received the news with quiet dignity. We could go elsewhere, Blake suggested. Find another minister in another town. Ruby shook her head. This is my home. My father is buried here. If we leave to be married, it's like admitting they're right about me that I should be ashamed and hide away. Blake took her hand, his admiration for her courage growing. Then we stay and fight. Together. The standoff continued into March. The Reverend, despite pressure from the Wilcoxes and others, refused to budge. Blake and Ruby continued their wedding preparations regardless, planning a simple ceremony in the meadow near Ruby's home if the church remained closed to them. It was during this tense time that an unexpected visitor arrived in Copper Creek, a U.S. Marshal named James Donovan. He rode into town on a dust-covered horse, his badge glinting in the spring sunshine. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where Copper Creek's new sheriff, a young man named Michael Tanner, greeted him with curiosity. Word spread quickly that the marshal was investigating a gang of outlaws believed to be operating in the territory. Blake, hearing the news from one of the ranch hands, felt a flicker of hope. Could these be the same men who had murdered Sheriff Foster and attacked Ruby? He rode into town immediately, finding Ruby at the general store. Pulling her aside, he told her about the marshal's arrival. It might be nothing, he cautioned, seeing the mingled hope and fear in her eyes. But if there's a chance these are the same men. I need to speak with him, Ruby said decisively. I can identify them. I've never forgotten their faces. Together, they went to the sheriff's office. Marshal Donovan was a weathered man in his 40s, with keen eyes that missed nothing and a demeanor that commanded respect without demanding it. Miss Foster, he acknowledged with a gentle nod after they were introduced. I've heard about what happened to your father. My condolences. Thank you, Marshal, Ruby replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I understand you're tracking outlaws. I believe I may have information that could help you. The marshal gestured for her to continue, his expression neutral but attentive. Ruby described the men who had attacked her and killed her father in careful detail, the leader with a scar through his eyebrow, the youngest with a distinctive silver belt buckle shaped like a snake, the tall one with a missing finger, the fourth with a red bandana he never seemed to remove. Recognition flickered in the marshal's eyes. The Reeves gang, he confirmed. They've been cutting a bloody path through 3 territories. Robbery, murder, worse. He glanced at Ruby with understanding. You're not their only victim, Miss Foster. But you might be the one who helps us bring them to justice. Hope surged through Ruby. You know where they are? We believe they're holed up in the mountains north of here. I've been tracking them for months, gathering evidence, building a case. With your testimony. The marshal paused. It would mean facing them in court, telling your story before a judge and jury. Are you prepared for that? The old fear rose up in Ruby's throat, threatening to choke her. But beside her, Blake's hand found hers, warm and steady. You don't have to decide now, he said softly. And whatever you choose, I'll support you. Ruby drew strength from his touch, from his unwavering faith in her. I'll testify, she told the marshal. They took my father from me. They took my reputation, my place in this community. I won't let them take my voice too. Marshal Donovan nodded, respect evident in his gaze. It won't be easy, but justice rarely is. Over the next days, plans were made. The marshal would lead a party to apprehend the gang. Blake immediately volunteered, despite Ruby's fears for his safety. I need to do this, he told her. Not just for you, but for Emily too. I couldn't protect my sister, but I can help bring these men to justice. Ruby understood, though it didn't lessen her anxiety. The posse assembled quickly: the marshal, Sheriff Tanner, Blake, and 4 other men, including Mr. Wilcox himself, who had once been a Texas Ranger before settling in Wyoming. The night before they were to depart, Blake came to Ruby's home. They sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool, but not cold, carrying the promise of true spring. If something happens to me, Blake began, but Ruby pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't, she pleaded. Please don't say it. Blake kissed her fingers, then gently moved them away. I need to say it, Ruby. If something happens, know that loving you has been the greatest joy of my life. I have never, not for one moment, regretted asking you to be my wife. Tears slipped down Ruby's cheeks. Come back to me, she whispered. Just come back. Blake pulled her close, inhaling the lavender scent of her hair. I promise to do everything in my power to return to you. And when I do, we're getting married, church or no church, reverend or no reverend. They clung to each other as the night deepened around them, neither wanting to let go, both aware of the dangers that lay ahead. The posse departed at dawn, riding north toward the mountains where the Reeves gang was believed to be hiding. Ruby stood at the edge of town, watching until the riders disappeared from view, then returned home to the hardest task of all: waiting. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Ruby threw herself into wedding preparations as a distraction, sewing her simple wedding dress with trembling fingers. Margaret Wilcox visited often, bringing news and companionship. Even some of the town women who had previously shunned Ruby began to soften, impressed by her courage in agreeing to testify. It was a full week before the posse returned. Ruby heard the commotion from her garden and ran to the road, heart pounding. 6 riders approached, dust-covered and weary. Her eyes scanned frantically for Blake, spotting him at last near the back, his arm in a makeshift sling, but very much alive. She ran to meet them, uncaring of the spectacle she made. Blake dismounted awkwardly with his injured arm, catching her with his good one as she flung herself into his embrace. You're hurt, she gasped, pulling back to examine him. Bullet grazed me, he assured her with a tired smile. Nothing serious. We got them, Ruby. All 4 of them. Marshal Donovan approached, touching his hat respectfully. Miss Foster. The Reeves gang is in custody, headed for the territorial prison to await trial. When the time comes, we'll send for you to testify. Ruby nodded, overwhelmed with emotion. Thank you, Marshal. All of you. Sheriff Tanner stepped forward. We found your father's badge on one of them, he said, holding out the tarnished star. Thought you might want it back. Ruby accepted the badge with trembling hands, tears blurring her vision. Her father's badge, the symbol of everything he had stood for, of the justice he had dedicated his life to. Thank you, she whispered again. That night, as Ruby tended to Blake's wound in the privacy of her home, he told her the full story. The posse had tracked the gang to an abandoned mining camp high in the mountains. There had been a fierce gunfight, during which Blake had been wounded. In the end, 2 of the gang members had been shot, but survived. All 4 were captured alive to face justice. They'll hang, Blake said quietly. After the trial, they'll hang for what they've done. To your father, to you, to others. Ruby's hands stilled on the fresh bandage she was wrapping around his arm. I used to dream of their deaths, she admitted. Every night for months, I would fall asleep imagining them suffering as they made me suffer. But now, she sighed, I just want it to be over. I want to look ahead, not back. Blake studied her face, marveling at the strength behind her delicate features. Then that's what we'll do. Look ahead. Together. News of the gang's capture spread through Copper Creek like fire through dry grass. The story grew with each telling how Marshal Donovan and the local men had cornered the notorious outlaws, how Sheriff Foster's killer would finally face justice, how Blake Warren had taken a bullet in the process. Perspectives on Ruby began to shift more noticeably. Women who had avoided her now greeted her on the street. Men tipped their hats respectfully. She was no longer just a victim but the daughter of a fallen lawman, brave enough to face her attackers in court. The most surprising change came from Reverend Phillips. 3 days after the posse's return, he appeared at Ruby's door, hat in hand, and discomfort evident in every line of his body. "Miss Foster," he began stiffly. "I've come to. That is, I wish to." He cleared his throat. "I've been reflecting on my position regarding your marriage to Mr. Warren." Ruby regarded him warily. "Yes, Reverend. I believe I may have been hasty in my judgment. The Bible teaches us that God's grace is sufficient for all circumstances. If you and Mr. Warren still wish to be married in the church, I would be willing to perform the ceremony." Ruby was momentarily speechless. Was this the same man who had declared her unfit for Christian marriage just weeks ago? "May I ask what changed your mind?" she finally asked. The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. "Prayer and reflection," he said, though Ruby suspected the Wilcoxes' influence and the changing town opinion had more to do with it. And Mr. Warren's words about Christ's example. They gave me pause for thought. Ruby considered his offer. Part of her wanted to refuse out of pride, to tell the Reverend they would manage without his belated blessing. But a wiser part recognized that healing could only come through forgiveness not just for her, but for the community. "Thank you, Reverend," she said at last. "I'll discuss it with Blake and let you know our decision." When Blake heard of the Reverend's visit, his first instinct was anger. "Now he decides you're worthy? After all the pain his rejection caused." "It's not about being worthy," Ruby said gently. "It's about moving forward. About healing this town as well as ourselves." Blake's expression softened. "You continue to amaze me, Ruby Foster. If you want to be married in the church, then that's what we'll do." "I want to be married to you," Ruby replied simply. "The where matters less than the who." In the end, they accepted the Reverend's offer, setting the date for early May, almost a year to the day since Sheriff Foster's murder. As the day approached, Ruby found herself caught between grief for all she had lost and joy for what she had found. Blake, sensing her conflicted emotions, suggested they visit her father's grave together. The cemetery was peaceful in the late April sunshine. Ruby knelt beside the simple marker, placing a bunch of wildflowers against the stone. "I wish he could have known you," she said softly to Blake, who stood respectfully nearby. "He would have liked you, I think." "I would have been honored to have his blessing," Blake replied, "though I suspect I would have had to work hard to earn it." Ruby smiled through her tears. "He was protective, but he wanted me to be happy above all else." She traced her father's name on the stone. "I am happy, Papa. Despite everything, I found happiness again." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with spring in full bloom across the valley. The church bell rang out joyfully, calling the town to witness the union of Blake Warren and Ruby Foster. To their surprise, the small church filled to capacity. Even those who had been most judgmental seemed determined to be present, perhaps seeking redemption for their own lack of charity. Ruby dressed in the simple gown she had sewn ivory cotton with lace she had carefully salvaged from her mother's wedding dress. Margaret Wilcox helped with her hair, weaving spring blossoms into the copper tresses before securing the modest veil. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her work. "Like a fresh start in human form." Ruby laughed softly. "That's exactly what this feels like. A fresh start." At the church, Blake waited nervously at the altar, handsome in a new suit purchased for the occasion. When the doors opened and Ruby appeared, his breath caught. She seemed to glow from within as she walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes never leaving his. With no father to give her away, Ruby had worried about this moment. But Mr. Wilcox had graciously offered to escort her, and now he placed her hand in Blake's with a warm smile before taking his seat beside his wife. Reverend Phillips conducted the service with newfound humility, his words about love and forgiveness holding deeper meaning for all present. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Blake's kiss was tender yet filled with promise, drawing spontaneous applause from the congregation. The celebration afterward was held in the meadow where they had originally planned to marry. Tables laden with food contributed by townspeople stretched beneath flowering trees. Children played, adults laughed and danced to fiddle music, and for the first time in nearly a year, Ruby felt truly part of the community again. "Mrs. Warren," Blake murmured in her ear as they swayed together to a slow melody. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," Ruby replied, resting her head against his chest. "Almost as wonderful as it feels." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the festivities, Marshal Donovan approached the newlyweds. He would be leaving the next day, continuing his rounds of the territory. "I've received word from the territorial judge," he told them quietly. "The trial is set for July. They want you both to testify." Ruby nodded, feeling Blake's arm tighten protectively around her waist. "We'll be ready." The marshal studied them both, approval evident in his weathered face. "What you've built here, finding love despite everything, it's a rare thing. Hold on to it." "We intend to," Blake assured him, drawing Ruby closer. That night, in the small cabin that was now their home, Ruby faced her final fear. Blake had been endlessly patient, understanding the trauma that made physical intimacy frightening for her. They had agreed to take things slowly, to let trust build naturally between them. "We have all the time in the world," he had told her. "There's no rush." But on their wedding night, Ruby found courage in Blake's gentle touch and unwavering respect. Their coming together was hesitant at first, then increasingly confident as fear gave way to trust and trust to desire. In Blake's arms, Ruby reclaimed something she had thought forever lost: the joy of giving herself freely, by choice, to someone who valued her completely. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Blake traced the curve of her cheek with tender fingers. "I love you, Ruby Warren." The new name still sent a thrill through her. "And I love you, more than I ever thought possible after." She hesitated, then finished simply, "After everything." Blake kissed her gently. "That's the miracle of it, isn't it? That after everything, we found each other. That after everything, there's still love to be discovered." Ruby nodded, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "A new beginning," she murmured. "The first of many," Blake promised. In July, as promised, they traveled to Cheyenne for the trial. Ruby testified with quiet dignity about the attack, identifying each member of the gang without flinching. Blake sat in the courtroom, his supportive presence giving her strength when memories threatened to overwhelm her. The guilty verdict brought a sense of closure rather than triumph. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the past. What mattered more was the future they were building together. They returned to Copper Creek, changed, more settled, more certain of their path forward. Blake continued working at the Wilcox Ranch, saving diligently toward their dream of land ownership. Ruby, with newfound confidence, started a small business selling preserves and baked goods to surrounding ranches and the general store. The town's attitude toward them had transformed completely. Where once there had been whispers and judgment, now there was respect. Ruby and Blake became an example of resilience, of love overcoming adversity. Young couples sought their advice. Older ones invited them to dinner. By the time winter returned to the valley, Ruby had news to share. Standing in their kitchen, cheeks flushed with more than just the heat from the stove, she took Blake's hands in hers. "I'm with child," she said, joy and nervousness mingling in her voice. Blake stared at her in wonder, then lifted her off her feet in a gentle embrace. "A baby," he breathed against her hair. "Our baby." Ruby laughed, a sound that had become wonderfully common in their home. Due in early summer, according to Mrs. Wilcox's calculations. Blake set her carefully on her feet, his hands lingering protectively at her waist. "Are you happy about this?" "Truly, happier than I ever imagined possible," Ruby assured him. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now look at us, married, respected in the community, and a child on the way." Her eyes grew misty. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and discover it's all been a dream." Blake kissed her soundly. "Not a dream. Just life as it should be, Ruby Warren. Just love as it was meant to be." The following June, under a sky washed clean by a brief summer shower, Ruby gave birth to a daughter they named Emily Hope, Emily for Blake's sister, who never had the chance to heal. Hope for the future they had built from the ashes of tragedy. As Blake held his daughter for the first time, her tiny hand curled trustingly around his finger, he looked at Ruby with eyes full of gratitude and awe. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me, for fighting to rebuild when it would have been easier to surrender." Ruby smiled tiredly from the bed, her copper hair damp against her forehead. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away, for believing I was worth loving when I couldn't believe it myself." Outside their window, Copper Creek continued about its business, horses and wagons passing on the road, children playing in the schoolyard, the church bell marking the hour. It was an ordinary day in a town that had witnessed both the darkest and brightest moments of Ruby's life. But inside the Warren home, a new chapter was beginning. One written not by circumstance or tragedy, but by choice and courage and abiding love. One that would continue long after the whispers of scandal had faded to distant memory, replaced by stories of resilience passed down through generations yet to come. For Ruby and Blake Warren, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.